Welcome back to another We Power podcast, the We Power broadcast. I'm excited for this podcast today. And yes, we are still going to stay in our theme really for 2022. And as long as we're led to stay on the theme being what works for you. Man, that's going to be vitally important for 2022 and beyond. Being able to recognize what works for you and being confident in what works for you, being a good stewardship in operating in what works for you. Because you see, ultimately, what works for you should be a benefit to the community in which you operate in. It should add value to the community in which you serve or should be serving. And so one of the things I've kind of adopted is any community that I've been invited into, I want to make sure that I'm giving the best and highest use of the service that I have identified that works for me. So in identifying what works for me should always add value. And in my case, I wanted to add a tremendous value into the communities that I have been invited to, into the tables that I have been invited to sit at. I've been invited to sit on a few different boards of organizations. And as I accept these roles, my number one goal is to bring the best of me in identifying what works for me, so that I can operate at a level, man, that's always going to be higher than what is expected. And so as we enter into this podcast is really going to be based on what's happening in our society, the changes that are going to be taking place, or the changes that are taking place when it comes to how we live and how we move and how we operate in society, and the changes that are taking place that you may be aware, you may not be aware. You may be aware, you may just not know how to move and operate with the changes that's going to be taking place in our society. And those changes I'm talking about is that the changes where the barriers that have separated the haves and the have-nots. The community resources that have been made available between the haves and the have-nots. In 2022, in the year 2022 alone, because of the barriers being removed, this year is going to create more financially independent people than we've seen in a long time. With all of the information available to us at the tip of our fingers at any given moment, with the different skill sets and talents that's available to access this information. And I would encourage you and I would challenge you, no matter who you are, no matter how young you are, no matter how old you are, you still have something to offer. You still have value to bring to the immediate community in which you operate, in which you live, in which you serve. So I'm strongly, this podcast, I'm strongly wanting to encourage everyone. And I appreciate the feedback that I've gotten on this particular theme. Identify what works for you. And whatever it is, identify what works for you. And I'm putting it out there. I'm making myself available to do one-on-one coaching to help you identify what works for you, to help you exceed and operate in the space where you will begin to operate in exceedingly abundantly success as you identify what works for you. Our country, our society, from local, city, state, our country in the United States, and all around the world, due to the information that's available to us through the World Wide Web, it has pretty much removed the barriers from those who have and from those who have not. And for those who are really trying to identify what works for them, the internet has made it easier for you to identify that. And it's really going to be essential, because our society is going to be moving to a system where the haves and the have-nots, although the barriers have been separated, where the have-nots have access to the same information and have the ability to have access to the same resources that the haves do. Our society is going to be separated even greater between the have and the have-nots. And so the sense of community, the sense of being a part of a community where you have a mindset of wealth building. I'm talking about wealth building in the sense of your spirit, your mind, your body, and community. Because with the separation, community as we know it is going to be different. Because of the internet, because of the income that's being made in the digital space, whether you're 80 years old or whether you're 15 years old, you have access, you have access to the income that's being generated in the digital space. And because everybody has access to the income that's being generated in the digital space, it's going to be very essential that we connect with community-minded wealth builders, those who have community wealth building at the forefront of what they're doing. There are a lot of organizations that I work with now that if I had to take all of their mission statements and tie them into one mission statement, the core of that would be community wealth building. Community wealth building. And the definition of wealth meaning just we're coming together to provide resources for everyone that's a part of the community. Community wealth building. Out of all the organizations that I deal with, from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the North Coast to the South Coast. Out of all those organizations I deal with, in person or virtually, if I had to tie all of their mission statements into one mission statement, it would be community wealth building. And the definition of wealth, meaning that we working together, we make resources available to everyone in the community, so no one in the community would have need of anything. And what the digital space is doing, and how powerful the digital space is becoming and making this happen, you will no longer be tied down geographically to where you normally receive your income. Those who will be caught in being tied down geographically to the source of their income, those are the ones that it's going to be very, 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 very important that you're tied to community. Because the laws are going to be different whether you're tied into a community or whether you're not connected to a community. Because of the digital space, you will no longer be required to be tied down geographically to your source of income. Basically saying that you will no longer have to be located, let's say in Indianapolis, Indiana, to earn your income. You will no longer have to be located in Detroit, Michigan to receive your income. Now, as we grew up, we were taught to go to school, get a job, work there for 30 years and retire or so. Or if you didn't go to school, you got a job at the factory, you got a job at the post office, you got a job at at GM or one of the large automakers and manufacturing, and there you worked there for 20, 30 years. You got to go watch and you retired. That required you to be tied down to a geographical area so you could get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, be at work at 7, work 10 to 12 hours, come back home and do it all over again. With the millionaires that are being created in the digital space, where you're located is not important. But the community that you're connected to in the digital space, that's going to be important. And so I'm focusing a lot of my time right now in this season in identifying what works for me in the digital space. And I have identified a community that I have connected myself to that really focuses on sharing community wealth. Wealth being the definition of making sure that all of the resources that are needed within the community are made available for everybody in the community, such that nobody in the community has a need of anything. That sounds like, I think it's chapter 2, verses 42 and so on in the book of Acts. And so finding what works for you in the digital space, identifying a community that works for you in the digital space. If you have no clue, or if you never even thought about it, I would encourage you to reach out to me. Find me on Facebook, Philip Anthony. shoot me an email, WePower, the number 1, at AOL.com. Shoot me an email. Say, hey, I would like to know more about how to identify what's going to work for me in the digital space. I teach a 6-week course on real estate for beginners. And the more I think about that course, I now have to implement real estate in the digital space. If you're thinking about getting into real estate, I would encourage you more to think about getting into the digital space, the real estate in the digital space. Because as the wealth transfer is taking place, the digital space is going to be about making multiple streams of wealth available to anybody who wants to be a part of it. But if you don't have the right information, if you're not connected to the right community, you could spend a lot of time, a lot of money, and still not be in position. The millionaires that are going to be made in the digital space, 90% of the success in the digital space, in my opinion, 90% of the success in the digital space is going to be tied down to 2 things. 90% of the success in the digital space, in my opinion, is going to be tied down to 2 things. 1, your position, and 2, the position of the community that you have attached yourself to, the position of the community that you're connected to. And then the multiplication of the resources that will be made available to you through the digital space, that will be tied down to one thing: whether or not you have identified what works for you in the digital space, such that you can add value in sharing the information that you have received. That's going to be important. That's going to be very, very important. Well, I know I may have left a lot more questions than answers, but back to the theme, being able to identify what works for you. I appreciate the phone calls. I appreciate the conversations that we've had, and I will make myself available to help you and share with you the information that's being shared with me to help you identify what works for you and to help you position yourself and your family for the wealth transfer that's taking place in the digital space. Well, I'm glad you tuned in to another WePower broadcast, another WePower podcast. And in spite of what you see, in spite of what you hear, there is a lot more good than bad that's happening in our society. Attach yourself to the good. Attach yourself to the good. Find out what works for you and make it do what it do, as Ray Charles would say. Well, I thank you. This podcast has been brought to you by Victories Insurance Agency and Stretch Indy. This podcast has been brought to you by Victories Insurance Agency and Stretch Indy. Support our own. If you don't have insurance, give Victoria a call and she can help you out. And if your body is tight, call Tony Williams with Stretch Indy and allow him to stretch you back to life. That's right. Victory's Insurance Agency, Victoria Moore, 317-772-3712. Call her about insurance. It's better to have and not need than to need and not have. And if you need to get stretched real good, call Tony at 317-828-1490. Stretch Indy. Allow him to stretch you back to life. Thank you for tuning in to the We Power Podcast.